I'm Dana Ellis Hunnes, and I wrote the book Recipe for Survival: What You Can Do to Live a Healthier and More Environmentally Friendly Life. And I wrote this book really because during my dissertation research for my PhD, I was learning all about climate change and the environment and food security in Ethiopia and around the world, and all the concerns of what's going to happen in the future. And then I also had just given birth to a tiny little baby, not even 6 pounds, not even quite, 3 kilograms. And I'm looking at him and I'm like, oh my gosh, I want this planet to be okay for him. And so all this information was percolating in my head, and I just said, okay, I've got to start putting this out on paper. Otherwise I'm going to forget a lot of what I'm thinking about, my concerns, my solutions. And so that's really how the book kind of started and eventually came to fruition.
Okay, great. We've all got our copies. Me and my colleague Kinga. Say hello, Kinga.
Hi.
Yes, I do have the copy.
Yeah. So we've been reading it. It's just out in the shop. We've been selling it.
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful.
And we've been inspired by it to do a bit of investigating. So we've sent out a little survey amongst our colleagues just to kind of find out about their shopping habits and how people make the choices they're making, and if they have any questions about their choices that they're making, because I thought that might be quite an interesting way to kind of get into some of these issues. So, it's not a massive sample of people, but it was a very interesting sample, and that came back with some things that were kind of generally true, manageable things that people generally felt they could kind of cope with, like meal planning and things like that. Those kind of things seemed quite easy and accessible. And then there were kind of some blockers as well to things that people, think they felt like these were the things that were stopping them from really shopping sustainably. So
Sure.
An interesting way in might be to have a look at some of those blockers and to see if you could come up with maybe some suggestions for how to overcome them, or how to think about them differently so that they're not really blockers anymore. They're opportunities or things like that.
Absolutely, yes. Sounds like a good plan.
Yeah, so I guess the top one is not going to surprise you, but it's price. So people wanting to make changes to things that they're buying, to buy more plant-based stuff, to buy less ready-made stuff, and it just becoming too expensive to sustain it, especially if you've got a big family. So is that something that you've come up with in a challenge that you've faced?
Yes, I mean, I've for sure heard about that concern and that barrier also here in the States. And, I did do a little research on that because I wanted proof or information to share with people to say, hey, you know what? It's actually less expensive, at least here in the States, and I imagine it would be in the UK as well, to purchase plant-based items, as long as you're doing it in a way that you're not looking for all these packaged processed foods. If you're buying more kind of close to nature, rice, beans, other legumes, other plant-based foods that are not heavily processed are actually quite less expensive than meats, than dairy, and then of course some of the plant-based meats that are out there. So I know that there is this, misconception that a plant-based diet is more expensive. However, I do think if you, look for bargains in your store and maybe buy somewhat in bulk during those sales, or stock up on shelf stable items, for example, the rice and the beans and things like that. And then of course, meal planning really can lower that price. And in the end, you'll actually save more money.
Yeah, I think they were finding that there was a lot of people who saying that they were buying kind of bulk to, especially staples, like store cupboard things. But then it was the kind of the fresh where everyone was kind of failing, because
yeah, no, that's true. I mean,
failure, you know.
Fresh fruits and vegetables, unfortunately, because of subsidies or they have to travel very long distances, can be more expensive. But that's actually also where a couple other tips I have in the book come into play. So, you know, again, when there are sales, you can buy more of the produce in bulk and then freeze it or can it or jar it or do something to make extend its shelf life. Or alternatively, you know, frozen fruits and vegetables are another really great way and less expensive to get some of those foods into your meal plan without having to, you know, break the bank.
Kinga, you are a plant-based eater. Are you?
Yes, that's correct.
Is that something that you found cost or anything like that prohibitive to getting when you started being plant-based?
Well, I do absolutely agree that it really depends what sort of foods you're going to buy. So anything, as you're saying, what that's processed and packaged would always be more expensive. But also what I found when I started obviously buying a lot of beans, rice, lentils, and so on, it's all really filling. So you don't really need large quantities. So it really satisfies your appetite. And then also it goes a really long way. And surely buying in bulk is a really, really good idea. But I also think, I don't know if you both agree with me, that another kind of misconception, which is a bit tricky about vegan diet, would be that each vegan diet is healthy. Because, is that right? Yeah? Because
well,
also there's
yeah,
so much.
Right. If it's highly processed,
Yes.
then no, it's not going to be a healthy vegan diet. If it's foods that are very much like their natural state, they're not necessarily in a package and they're one ingredient, and you know, absolutely, that would be, you know, a much healthier way of eating.
Yes.
Agreed, 100%.
And also I think this is just something I was so used to because I grew up in Poland. So when I was younger, we would never eat any fruit or vegetables which weren't in season.
Sure.
So everything was really planned according to seasons. And of course we had frozen fruit and vegetables, but we could never get it outside of the season, which I really, really think is something we should aim for, shouldn't we?
Yes, no, because when you buy in season, it means that you're buying locally grown. So again, you're lowering your footprint just from, you know, where the food is coming from, but also, you know, food just tastes best when it's in season. So absolutely, I 100% agree with you. And my best friend growing up is Polish as well. So
okay,
yeah, similar type of upbringing where you eat foods in season, and you know, I think it's a very eco-friendly, but also just wallet friendly and just like healthy way of thinking about food.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's sort of it brings me to another one of my blockers though, which is that people tend to buy, as well as seasonal, you kind of you have a certain number of recipes that you rely on. So these sometimes require things that are not seasonal, or that you have to, you know, you've got children saying, oh, please, can we have this for dinner or whatever? And you're like, well, actually, that requires me to go and buy some avocados, and I'd really rather not do that. But so there are these kind of blockers, like how can you change sort of that inbuilt kind of reliance on certain recipes, certain foods that you always fall back on? Are there tips that you have for kind of overcoming really kind of reflexive cooking?
No, I mean, I think that's a really great question. You know, I think there has to be some leeway. Like, I don't expect perfection from people, and I don't think people should, you know, expect perfection from themselves. And so if there is the occasional recipe that's just like your family's go-to and it does require something perhaps out of season, I mean, we're all working, we're all, you know, parents and family members, and sometimes you just have to fall back on something you know everyone will eat. With that said, you know, I do think looking for new recipes that expand your palate and your cultural tastes And also getting the children involved is really, I think, a great idea. Like we go to the store and we'll bring our son and we'll say, okay, I want you to pick one new fruit or vegetable that you've never tried. And, we'll find a recipe for it. And so I think that's something that people can do with their children or their nieces, nephews, grandchildren, and just do try new recipes that don't seem like too difficult, meaning they have 1,000,001 ingredients in them, but something that's fairly simple. But again, looking more for some resources that are, again, in season and local as much as possible.
Yeah, I guess in some way the pandemic helped and hindered that, because people were kind of defaulting to what they knew, what was safe.
Sure. Yes.
Not going out so much to do exploratory shopping, not taking their children, one person would go out to the shop.
Correct. And same thing in my family too, which is where actually joining like a CSA, community supported agriculture, can also really help with that, because when you join a community supported agriculture, you get these boxes from a local farm and it's in-season produce. So you right there, I mean, you don't have to bring the family shopping, you get stuff in season and you're looking at it and you're like, oh my gosh, what's a rutabaga? What can I do with a rutabaga? We had to look up some recipes and found out, hey, roasting it is actually one of the best things you can do. Or what is a parsnip and what do you do with a parsnip? So I do think there are multiple outlets for ways to get in-season produce and try new things without it really either breaking the bank or being too onerous on the family as a whole.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of one of the responses to the survey, where I'll just read out what they wrote. They said, "We used to use Oddbox, a subscription surplus veg company, and plan meals around what came in our weekly box, but found that this led to a lot of food waste. Sometimes you just don't want to have to make meals out of 8 aubergines."
Yes, this is true. That is true. We actually have a really delicious aubergine recipe. Because we didn't know aubergine was eggplant, we actually had to look up the translation.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, I know. Aubergine just sounds so much more beautiful. I mean, truly. We really need to work on some of the way we name fruits and vegetables here in the States. But, we found a brand new recipe for aubergine and chickpeas, and it was very curry inspired, and it was truly delicious. So I think I totally hear what people are saying. If you do get the same greens or the same vegetables and fruits in the box 5-6 weeks in a row, which has happened to us, you do tend to start getting a little tired of it. But my feeling is, if you deal with it right when you get it, process the greens, cook them, and then store them, you don't necessarily have to eat them all at that moment. You can store them and build a cache for later, build for when it is out of season. And then you can have some of those, those greens that may be in a little bottle or in your freezer.
Kinga, I know you shop for you and your husband is Flexitarian. You described.
That's correct.
So how do you do that?
We just came up with quite easy solutions. So most of the dinners we obviously eat together, and most of the dinners are vegan. So we would eat a lot of salads, and then he would sometimes eat bread and cheese and some chorizo. That's his big weakness. But we don't really cook meat in the house. So we don't do any poultry, we don't do any fish, and we don't do any other kinds of meat. Mm-hmm. So this is his treat sometimes when we go out. And if we go out and if we go to a restaurant which offers flexible options. So he did change a lot.
Yeah, no, and I think that's actually, I think that's very reasonable. Same thing in our house. We are vegan in our house. We only cook vegan meals if we go out to eat and my husband wants something with a little cheese on it. I mean, that's, I think you have to be within reason. If we demand every person to go vegan tomorrow or today, I mean, that's just not going to happen. We have to be reasonable. We have to be, somewhat flexible, and we have to also be realistic, which is to say, I know people are not going to go vegan. The whole world is not going to go vegan tomorrow. although it would save something like 75% of all farmland across the world. But if people were more, I think, conscientious and conscious and purposeful with their food choices and really did try to reduce the amount of animal products they're eating, we could make a huge difference.
Okay, so something that Kinga and I were talking about, we were coming up with some questions that we'd like to ask you. One of the ones that we threw out there was, I don't know if you might not know the answer to this, maybe you do, you probably do, is if you had to do your shopping or think about your groceries like someone from a historical period, like which historical period would you say had the best approach to cooking and eating that you could think of?
Oh my goodness.
I know, right?
That is a tough question. That's a humdinger I was not expecting. You know, in some ways, I kind of harken back to the early 1900s, because refrigeration was just sort of coming into fashion. And so people really did have to be very cognizant about their food choices, and how and also the Depression, so people had to avoid food waste. They had to be very conscientious about what they were eating and when they were eating and how they were eating. So I kind of feel like if we could think back to the 20s and 30s a little bit, that would be a very reasonable way of thinking. And then maybe one other one would be sort of the Paleolithic era, and not so much in the sense of the paleo diet that people try to follow now, which is not a Paleolithic diet at all, but more to the idea of gather your fruits and vegetables and grains and eat those first. And then, there was a little hunting going on to supplement, but it was not the main course. So those are probably the two periods I can kind of think about in that respect.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you went for the early hundreds. Actually, well, because that's where Kinga and I kind of went as well. But
oh, really?
We went there for a different reason, because I guess it's country specific. So you mentioned your Great Depression.
Right.
We were thinking World War II. We're thinking rationing.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. People having to work with what they've got, and then Kinga reminded me that they were being rationed in Poland quite recently. So
yes. I didn't realize. Okay.
Yeah, I think that sort of reminded me, thinking about rationing and stuff, reminded me of I don't know if you have any research on this, but how effective is it in terms of sustainable change that we make the changes ourselves? Is it more effective to do that, or does it work better to have these kind of institutional changes? Is there any kind of evidence for the success either way of those things?
Yeah, I think it depends on what the topic or what the action is. I think with dietary change, the research points to the notion that if you are making those changes and you are the one that is very cognizantly saying, I'm going to make this change and I'm going to do it this way, and it becomes a habit, it's more lasting and sustainable in terms of how long you will follow it, versus it coming from the top down and saying, you have to do this. Now, ultimately, for example, during World War II or the Depression, when there just wasn't enough to really go around and institutional or governmental changes had to be enforced, that was, not by choice, but by practicality. So in that case, I think there was a more willingness to engage as on a countrywide level. But I think ultimately nowadays, when it comes to personal behavior change, I do think if you are making those decisions and you are following through and setting goals and achieving those goals, it is more of a longer lasting reality.
Yeah, I think expecting our states to intervene helpfully isn't always the best thing to do.
Well, I mean, that's so true. We saw that, you know, at the COP of the Conference of the Parties 26. We see that in the United States with our government failing to pass legislation to really act on climate change, and all over the world we're seeing that. It's just such a challenging situation because people don't want to pay more for things that they need necessarily to make the environment greener, but that's kind of where we are.
I also was going to ask, I know, so something that I think you've spoken to before, Dana, is the idea of how we talk about, how we identify ourselves as vegan, vegetarian, or just plant-based eaters, and how sometimes it can be, or plant-based purchasers, you know, how it can be, sometimes these labels can be detrimental to actually kind of getting people to jump on board with certain things. Is that something that you found?
Yes, I do. I still feel like there at times is a stigma with the word vegan, and I wish that wasn't so, because it really is a compassionate sort of way of living. However, you know, not everyone wants to be called vegan. Not everyone wants to be called vegetarian, because maybe they're not doing it for the animals, or maybe they're not doing it for their own, you know, the environment or their own personal health. Maybe they have some other reason. And so I do think labels can be stigmatizing still at times. And I do think that by saying I'm going to eat a plant-based diet, it's more about the food and it's more about what's on the plate than what you identify as. So I do think, you know, for some people who are not necessarily ready or wanting to be labeled in such a way, that focusing more on the quality of the diet or what's on the plate can be more friendly or more open to adoption.
Yeah, I think in my case, I'd certainly say that was true. I'm not a plant-based eater, but I do try to reduce the amount of meat that we have in our house. I'm afraid I will be a cheese eater for my entire life. I just can't stop. There's so many different cheeses, so many artisan things, you know.
Right. And yeah, and so I don't think you, right. And so I think, you know, by not having to label yourself in any one way, I do think that kind of gives yourself some room for forgiveness. Again, I'm not someone who looks for perfection. I'm someone who looks for progress. If you're making those choices and trying to be more environmentally friendly, it's a journey for everyone. You know, it took me a while to go from omnivore, because I didn't know anything, to vegan. But, you know, not everyone wants to call themselves that, and that's okay. So I really do focus on what's on your plate, because I think that's more important than what you call yourself.
Yeah, I think the psychology of the whole business is really interesting, actually. And I don't know how far you covered that in your own research, but like in terms of like for me personally, for example, I find it really hard to say I'm gonna do veganuary, just because I don't like the kind of psychology of being told that is my month that I will be vegan in that month. And I find it a bit like I'd rather just kind of do it in my own time. I want it to be my decision, not because someone's telling me that there's a month for it or something like that.
Yeah, no, and that's absolutely rational. And, you know, my mother is a psychologist, and my great uncle was a world famous psychologist. His name was Albert Ellis. And he wrote numerous books on psychology and rational thinking. So, you know, I think if I hadn't become a dietitian and an environmentalist, I probably would have become a psychologist, because there's a lot about food that is very psychological and very emotional. You know, we all come to food through our families, through our growing up. And so the foods that we like, the foods that we eat are cultural, and they are very emotional and emotive. So, you know, I agree with that entirely. I think you have to make that choice. And of course, when people are telling us you have to do this, it makes you not want to do it. So I don't know if that's out of spite or out of fear or out of just like, don't tell me what to do. But I agree with that notion. I would say the idea of veganuary, a lot of people make changes in January because it's a new year. So I can understand why they focus so much on January, to your point. But again, everyone has to do things sort of in their own time, in their own schedule, at their own pace.
Yeah, I think I'm just a bit bolshy in that respect. I'm the same with dry January. I'm like, no, I'm not going to do dry January either.
Well, at least at least you know yourself, and that's important.
I know.
That's half the battle. Yeah,
I know my limitations.
That's right.
Another thing that came up that actually I just wanted to ask you about was honey. This is something that I've always wondered about in terms of a vegan thing, that vegans don't eat honey. It's excluded from the diet. And I just wondered if there was sort of, I guess there must be a very good reason for it, but there's also quite a lot of health benefits in honey. And are there any kind of substitutes that have the same benefits naturally occurring that you could have if you're going to pursue a vegan diet?
Yeah, it is controversial in some ways because honey is excluded because it requires like animal labor, and it's like stealing, this hard work from the honeybees that have had to go and produce this honey. And so that's the main reason why it's excluded. As far as the health benefits, there are, a number of health benefits, of course, from honey, and its immune properties, its anti-inflammatory properties. And I think probably the closest substitute would be if you can find it, like some kind of nectar, like from a plant, or like even rose water, for example. But of course, it's not going to have the same necessarily health properties. With that said, honey is also a very concentrated sugar, so you don't want to do too much of it. Even so, but really the main reason why it is excluded from a vegan diet is because of the involvement of the bees and their labor, and how, and in many instances, they're like transported from farm to farm to farm to, pollinate, but also to produce the honey.
Yeah, and I guess like with everything, there are people who are responsible beekeepers who are,
of course,
their environments and all of that stuff, and then there are people who are just farming, industrial beekeeping.
Yeah, like my in-laws had a neighbor who was one of those like very responsible people. They just literally had a box of bees, and whatever they wanted to do and however they wanted to live, and if they ever had too much honey, because I guess it really does build up over time. I'm not all that knowledgeable about beekeeping. They would take some of the excess, but they always left plenty for the bees.
Yeah, and I think also, speaking like nutritionally, and it's that honey that's actually going to be useful, that honey that's produced in small batches locally, because I think some of I know from my daughter has hay fever, and I know that if you have the local kind of plant environment, that something in that honey that can help you to fight the pollen.
That's absolutely true. There is data to support that. If you're eating local honey and you have allergies to like pollen or something, that it actually can help with that.
That's quite cool. Okay, right. I have one more question. Kinga, do you have anything?
I think I've got one more question as well.
Okay.
Who's first?
You go.
Okay. So one of the crucial points you make in your book is, of course, to educate others. So I'd like to ask you a very specific question regarding educating children. So how should we explain to children that meat is animals and really the truth about meat industry?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the age of the child. My son is now 8 years old, and we've sort of been talking about this stuff since he was born, but not to the degree that you would with an adult, like showing maybe explicit videos and things like that. But certainly having a conversation. I mean, in our house, we've always been plant-based since he was born. So we just don't have meat at the table. But you know, like if we're out at a friend's house or something, I mean, again, this is like before the pandemic, and now we just have like one family or two families that we regularly see and we know they're safe. But if there is like chicken on the table and he wants to try it, I say, yeah, if you want to try it, we're not going to have it in our house. If you want to try it, just so you know what it tastes like, you are welcome to try it. But then we do have these conversations of, okay, well, that did come from an animal. It came from a chicken. And, you know, we do talk about it. We don't talk about a lot of the like explicit horrors that happen on factory farms. But, you know, I do think having a conversation about it so children are aware of where their food comes from is also very important. And I do remember one time we were driving, we were coming home from the mountains that are, you know, a couple hours from us. Last winter was like the one day trip we took in a year and a half. And beside us was this huge truck carrying pigs in it. And he saw that and he said, what's going on? Why is there a big truck with the, you know, pigs? And you know, we had a conversation about it, about where those pigs are going. And, you know, the slaughterhouse, we didn't go into a lot of detail, but we did talk about it, that they're on their way to end their lives. So I do think, you know, having these conversations is important, but you also have to understand what their level of understanding is and don't fear monger.
Thank you.
So I have one question, which is kind of to do with the writing of the book. I wondered if, because I can tell by the timing of its publication that it was probably a lockdown baby in many respects. But like, do you think it would be a different book if it weren't for pandemic? Do you think there's anything in that the pandemic's sort of thrown out there that you might not have considered if you had been writing this at a different time?
I think the main thing that I probably added to the book as a result of the pandemic was the focus on sort of the conditions of animal agriculture or animal farming. I mean, I think I would have touched on that to some degree from like the antibiotic use, but I think from the idea of, you know, our interactions with animals and how that's a source of new infectious diseases, I don't necessarily think I would have touched on that in the book, in the first half of the book, had the pandemic not happened. That's really the major one that I think I added to the book because of, you know, the COVID. Yeah. But otherwise, I think probably most of the other things in the book would have still been in the book.
And finally, I did say one question, but actually I've got another. What would you like people to have as your kind of top takeaway or top 3 takeaways from reading your book?
I think that the top takeaways I want people to get are really, there are issues happening on this planet that we need to be aware of, but there are things that we can do to help. We are not powerless. Even when, you know, government is not doing anything, we are not powerless to make change and to take action and to help others understand some of the issues that are going on as well. So I think that's really the biggest takeaway is don't feel despondent, don't feel depressed. I mean, you may feel depressed after reading the first half of the book, but then look to the second half where I give the solutions and I give the actions you can all take right now, today, to really make a difference. So I think those are the biggest takeaways from the book is, you know, don't just sit there and feel sad, do something about it.
Yeah, and I mean, the second half is just packed with tips, things that you can do, changes that you can make. And I, for one, would recommend that everyone read it.
Yes, and we also hope that it will spark many conversations in the bookshop, because this is basically one of the best things about being a bookseller. We can actually talk to people about the book and then exchange opinions. And so I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I would love to be able to answer those questions on the spot on that date that you have held for me.
Yeah.
And if, you know, there's other opportunities where, and I know Alice, you sent me one this morning, but if there are other times or opportunities where you get people like, oh, I just have these burning questions. I mean, you know, I want to interact with people and answer them and help on their journey.
Well, hopefully, I mean, we've talked about loads here, but hopefully all we've done is inspire more interest and more conversations. I know there's lots more that I could say, for example. So hopefully that's exactly what we've done. And when we meet again on the 3rd of April, we'll be able to fire some more challenging things at you.
Yeah, no, these are all really great questions and get me thinking about it and ways that I can also make it more accessible for people.
Fabulous. Brilliant.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you for talking to us, Dana, and I really appreciate your time. It's been really, really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it too.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon.
Sounds
yes.
good. All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.